Why am I at a book event for a book in which I penned no words? Because when it was written, it was my voice they heard. My voice is the word you read, need indeed, should believe, and retrieve from beneath the systems constructed upon it. It is crushing. Stop hushing me because you think I'm loud as you crowd and shroud my freedom with anger and noise, as if I have no control or poise or truth to tell. But truth be told, these cuffs on my neck historically controlled ancestral steps so they couldn't flee. And I've always said it couldn't be me, but it simply transitioned to a foot or a knee can't breathe or be free. And some don't see that we need to reimagine justice like square 1, 2, 3 strikes and I'm out. And then in a system that's harsh and phony, very different than parsimony, a new vision of justice. Because it's typically been that justice is just us trying to discuss us with just us. And when we are heard, it's in the interest of brevity. We get one word, one sentence, life. Inevitably, the levity and light made in my life leaves no room for insight into this practice of pernicious ignorance, which is just a ridiculous indifference, as if I'm unworthy of investment. But this is just a general assessment. Like the over-implementation of a 3/5 compromise, we need to revise. Yes, foundational change to get to the root of this deranged practice of injustice where it's always me only, hate baked into the system, hence the acrimony. Yes, I'm mad, but now we got the fixins. Main ingredient, the Vivian Nixons. Impacted and relevant, cuffs getting loose. Thank you for hearing me, Jeremy and Bruce.
Who knew that you could rhyme parsimony with something else? But you did it. So I'm Jeremy Travis. I'm Executive Vice President at Arnold Ventures for Criminal Justice, and just thrilled to see this turnout here tonight. Friends, colleagues, co-conspirators, new friends, hangers-on, people who like the food, people who want to read a book. Whatever brought you here, thank you so much for coming. I have a couple other thank yous that I want to get out of the way quickly because we do this work in gratitude for the support that we receive. First and foremost, to the MacArthur Foundation. Lori Garducki is here and has made not this possible, but so many things that I've done and that Bruce and I have done together. So thank you to Lori and the MacArthur Foundation for making Square One a possibility. Thank you also to Diane Wachtel, who's here somewhere, the New Press. This baby was your idea. You found something in these essays out of Square One. You said, yes, there's a book there. Parsimony was the lead, and we're here because you helped guide us. It wasn't always easy. It wasn't always easy, Diane. So brought us here. Thanks to the Columbia School of Journalism for what a beautiful location, and to the Justice Lab at Columbia and Bruce and the team there for their work in incubating these ideas. And I have a personal thank you, and if you read the book, you'll understand why, to Daryl Atkinson for being my co-author on the lead chapter, Power of Parsimony. We discovered each other before the executive session, but it was clear to me when we put the group together for the executive session that Daryl had to be there. And I discovered that we had something in common when he gave a talk at John Jay, and he was citing the National Academy of Sciences findings on parsimony as his North Star. And I said, this is my guy. So he and I came together to write this book that then gave the title to the volume. So some of you may need to know, it would be nice if no one needed this, what is Square One? But I'm going to assume that some of you don't know exactly what the Square One project is. And we just had a meeting of the executive session of Square One. Many of the authors are represented in this book. A fabulous meeting. We celebrated the end of our first chapter and our 5th year anniversary. So we were founded 5 years ago. It's been a remarkable 5 years. When you think about what's happened over those 5 years, this was the era of Donald Trump. This is the resurgence of law and order. This was the time of the pandemic. This was the aftermath after the murder of George Floyd and the protests throughout the streets of America, the backlash that we've witnessed to the very real rise in violent crime. This has been a consequential 5 years. But during these 5 years, what is so amazing to me as I sat and listened to my colleagues at the executive session is how we have all found the executive session ideas and some of the things that we've developed together to be leading us, inspiring us through this difficult time. So we're 5 years old this month. But the genesis, the origin story, goes back a little bit further to the report of the National Academy of Sciences on the causes and consequences of high rates of incarceration. I had the honor of chairing that panel, being a co-editor of that volume, and it was in that work that I discovered, even though we knew each other before, I discovered my sort of soulmate in this work, which is Bruce Western. So he was the vice chair and the co-editor of the book. After that book was published, 2014, we sat down, a number of conversations, committed, we wanted to work together because we liked the way we worked together. B, we wanted to know what would we do that would be a sort of worthy effort after the National Academy panel. It was so draining, difficult, consequential. Some say that report is actually a landmark. And what was clear was we wanted to do something that would help guide, to make it really grandiose, guide the country, but at least in our own minds, help us think about what might be next, sort of a big leapfrog into the future, a generation away. And that led us to the idea of Square One. That led us to the idea of bringing people together to try to, our tagline, reimagine justice. So the genesis, the origin story of Square One goes back to 2014, and I am eternally grateful to Bruce for his friendship and his support and inspiration for this journey. So you'll hear more from Bruce about the executive session, which led to the volume that you're going to hear more about tonight. So I won't describe the executive session much more. But I want to just say that Square One is more than the executive session. Over those 5 years, we also sponsored roundtables around the country. It was a sequence that sort of drove our staff mad. Every 3 months, we were either doing an executive session meeting or a roundtable meeting somewhere around the country. And we wanted to sort of spread the energy and to bring more people on board and to explore the topics that were nominated by the executive session at our first meeting. What were those topics? First one, the history of white supremacy in America and its impact in terms of the execution of the law in America and the damage done, particularly to communities of color and other marginalized communities, and overcriminalization and punitive excess. That was our first meeting in Durham, where we commissioned papers on those topics, now been published. That was the launch of the Square One Roundtable. We then had subsequent roundtables in Oakland on human dignity, in Detroit on violence, both interpersonal violence and state violence, and the last roundtable on the reimagining the social contract. So the roundtables have also fed the Square One energy that we are experiencing when we think about the Square One history. And each of those sessions started with a paper on history. We have become firmly committed to the importance of reckoning with history as the precondition to our goal of reimagining justice. And those papers are all published on our website and in academic journals if you want to see them. But through the roundtable, we connected with hundreds of people who either were participants or observers, and thousands of people who watched the proceedings of the roundtable on our live stream. And again, it's all available for you at the Square One website. And each session that we've had has intentionally had a mix of academics, activists, formerly incarcerated people, people impacted by the system, stakeholders who work in government, community organizers, and we find consistently that mix of voices is the sine qua non for the task of reimagining justice. So we've learned a lot over the past 5 years. So Square One is now coming to an end in terms of the first chapter of Square One, 5 years from then till now, with the publication of this book. And that's what we're celebrating tonight. And I'm told that you'll all get free copies somewhere down the road. So we encourage you to read it and find inspiration in it. But Square One is just begun. And you'll hear more in the future about the work that we're doing at the local level in Oklahoma. There's a Square One Roundtable Reimagining Justice in Oklahoma that we heard about today from our friend Chris Steele. The Square One work in Multnomah County. Abby Stamp, who's here somewhere. You can raise your hand if you want to talk Multnomah, however they talk out there. And Nneka Jones Tapia is doing work in Cook County. And the Square One project is also in April going to launch a new initiative taking this theme of reckoning with our racial history as a precondition to reimagining justice and making that the topic for the next 3 years of Square One, but with the launch of the collaborative on reckoning and justice led by the one and only Vivian Nixon and Suki McMahon, who's here. Hi, Suki and Vivian. So if you're interested in that, please connect with them. So we have a tiger by the tail. There's good stuff going on. We are very excited to be at this moment where we have the papers from the first 5 years ready for you to take home and enjoy. And I'm going to invite my friend, colleague, brother-in-arms to the podium to talk about the executive session, Bruce Weston. Please join me in welcoming Bruce.
Thanks a lot, Jeremy, and good evening, everyone. So we're here today to celebrate the publication of this new book, Parsimony and Other Radical Ideas for Justice. And this grew out of a process called an executive session. And my job tonight is to tell you a little bit about the origin story of this book. So as Jeremy was saying, this book is the product of the Square One project. So Square One is now 5 years old. It's a narrative change project. We're trying to change the way we talk about justice in America. And we did this by convening groups of justice leaders of very different kinds. Now, before I get into the story, I should say that throughout this project, I owe a very deep debt to my dear friends and colleagues, Jeremy Travis and Catherine Huffman. Jeremy and Catherine are two people in my life who see the glass as half full. And I have to say they've had tremendous patience with me because I've been insisting for the last 5 years that it's really half empty. And I think those half full people are pretty unique. And I've been fortunate enough to work with two of them over the last 5 years. And I also have to acknowledge Anamika Dwivedi and Jasmine Sandelson, who literally moved mountains to pull the volume together. So often with edited books, this is a book that has 30 different contributors, and often with edited books, a group of likely contributors are invited to contribute a paper, and they reach into the file drawer of things that they've written in the past and maybe they've been working on lately that could possibly fit into the themes of a volume. The papers in this volume had a very different origin, grew out of what's called an executive session. What's an executive session? An executive session is a 3-year deliberative process where a group of about 30 people meet every 6 months, sitting as a board of directors on a national policy problem. The original executive sessions were held at Harvard Kennedy School, and they were focused on policing. And the first meetings back in the 1990s involved about 30 police chiefs sitting around a table, and the focus of those early executive sessions was community policing. And in some ways, the authors that we're celebrating tonight went through a similar process. This was a group of about 30 people who are involved in a sustained engagement over a period of 3 years. The big difference is that they weren't police chiefs and they weren't talking about community policing. Instead, we had a very diverse group that included many activists, academics, practitioners, and instead of 30 white men who were meeting in the 1990s, today's executive session was demographically diverse, and it included people with lived experience of the era of mass incarceration. Instead of community policing, the charge for today's group was to re-examine the foundations of how we respond to problems of violence and other harms that form in contexts of harsh poverty and racial segregation. We had a lot of challenging conversations over the last 3 years. But as the group gradually got to know each other, trust was built and a shared set of values emerged around which the group could rally and also productively disagree. And we'll talk a lot tonight about the shared values of human dignity and healing and historical reckoning. These were very much the touchstones that have grown out of the Square One process over the last 5 years. Suffice to say, these core values emerged through deliberation. This wasn't drawn up on some whiteboard before we started, but emerged through the sustained engagement of the group. And I think about this, and I think it's important because I think we're in a time right now of very intense political and social polarisation. And I want to think that sustained conversation among people who share a fundamental set of values but disagree over a whole range of issues over years can engage with each other in a way that builds trust and can help us address some of the country's greatest challenges. And so that was our methodology. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine Huffman, who's the Executive Director of the Square One project.
Thank you, Bruce and Jeremy, and thank you again, Aisha. I'm going to invite my fellow discussants to join me here on stage. Judge Nancy Gertner, Tracy Mears, and Vivian Nixon. Will you all join me on the stage? Welcome, everyone. So we're going to take a few minutes to talk amongst ourselves here about the book that has just come out, the process that led to it, and some of the ideas. And then we'll open up for a few minutes of questions from all of you, and we will then return to the festivities of the bar and the food and everything else as well, which you should also feel free to continue while we're talking here. So it's really just an honor to be here with the three of you who have been such an important part of this entire process that Bruce just described, and then, of course, also contributing authors to this book, Parsimony. And I'm going to start us off with a question for you, Vivian. So Vivian Nixon is, among many other things now, the writer-in-residence for the Square One project, and we are very fortunate to have her full-time focused on these questions and these issues and working with all of us. So Vivian, you're one of the contributors to Parsimony, also the writer-in-residence at Square One now. Tell us about that journey from 2018 to the present day. What impact has Square One had over the last 5 years, and what do you hope comes from here?
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, everybody, for showing up. Really good to see you all. I have to give a shout out to the students who were in. Bruce and I taught a class last semester. Thank you, students, for showing up. I feel like Sally Fields, you like us, you really like us. So, I'm thinking about this differently than I thought I would answer it. But literally, the engagement with the Square One project shifted my thinking in many ways. So I'll take you kind of on a journey. You have the background of how the project got started. I was invited to be part of the executive session, much to my surprise. And my first response was like, I don't belong in this room. These are all renowned scholars, researchers, heads of departments of corrections for states, heads of police departments. This is not where I belong. And I struggled through the entire 3 years trying to write anything that I was willing to share with anybody. But the incredible team at Square One, and Bruce talked about the building of trust, was always very patient and welcoming. And I learned over time that this was something different. It wasn't like the rooms I had been in. Very early on, it became clear that there was some other people in the room who also had a particular voice, who had something they wanted to say about where we needed to go with this conversation. And it just took off. And the conversation stayed focused on where it needed to be focused. The things that we need to reckon with in our history before we even talk about justice. You can't talk about reimagining any system of justice if you can't look at history and tell the truth about history. And then figure out how we reconcile with that history, one with another, not with the purpose of retribution, punishment, shame, and blame, which is exactly what we're asking the system not to do, but with the goal of real reconciliation and a path forward to community well-being and safety that doesn't include excessive punishment and deprivation of the best things life has to offer to certain groups of people. I knew I was in the right space when I figured that out, when I saw that they weren't going to let go of the core of the conversation, the root of the problem. Because the root of the problem is not somebody selling loose cigarettes. The root of the problem is not somebody violating a traffic law. The root of the problem is not somebody stealing a loaf of bread from a grocery store. The root of the problem is that we've never, ever dealt with this country's history of state violence against particular bodies. That conversation was allowed in that room, and that's why I stayed. And then I quit my job and came to work here.
We're so glad you made that excellent decision, Vivian. That was a wonderful decision. Thank you for that, Vivian. And moving on, I'll turn over to Tracy. Nancy, you just heard from Vivian the perspective that she shared about this journey that we've been on together. Parsimony, what is parsimony? What does it have to do with that? Probably, I'm not the first person to ask you, wait, parsimony? What does that mean?
She just said she thinks I should go first. I just said the same thing to you. Let me say something about how I got here. I felt like an imposter too. Because I was an instrument of mass incarceration for 17 years. I was a federal judge. And this reckoning was a reckoning with history and a reckoning with social issues, and it was also a reckoning with what I had presided over, and was critical to my thinking about how to look back at that history and say, what could I do more? What did I do? I was a judge at a time when there were mandatory minimums and mandatory guidelines. And I gave a talk when I first left the bench in which I said, when I go through all the people I sentenced, I believe that 80% of the sentences were unfair, unjust, and disproportionate. So this was a conversation that was life-affirming to me, to both be critical of what I have done, to write about how these are conversations that judges never participate in, ever. Judges talk about rules as if the rules had some relationship to justice, and they don't. And this was a conversation about justice and reckoning. You do want me to define parsimony? The lawyer brain in me says parsimony is the least drastic, punitive measure that can be applied to affect public safety. And what you pack into that is an open question, but mandatory minimums, mandatory guidelines, the regime I was in was the reverse. It was almost as if every year Congress bid up incarceration and the Sentencing Commission just bid up the numbers. It was like a lottery as opposed to a meaningful, just system. So parsimony should be where we should be, and should be reducing the footprint of the criminal legal system to the extent that we can. Now you have to talk, Tracy.
Thank you for that. My name is Tracy Mears, and I am a law professor. I do work primarily on public policy around these issues. Do a lot of work on social science, actually, to support the policy. So at the executive session, I viewed it as my job, basically, to be a support for people like Vivian, where they would come up with these amazing ideas, and I would think, okay, as a researcher, what conceptual framework can I apply to this? What research can help support and validate these ideas so that we can actually have policy that will be widely accepted? And when I think about parsimony in that sense, the way that Judge Gertner put it is just really a starting point. And I think you can see that with the ideas that Vivian was just spinning out. Because if we think about parsimony as only looking at the ways in which the institutions of legal processing work today, and then think, well, they should be as least harmful as possible and have the smallest carceral footprint as possible, that's a harm reduction strategy. But a lot of the things that we talked about in the session were really about how the state, and I'm going to talk about it in the way that I think about it and write about it, how the state should support citizens' safety projects, which are not confined to the typical way one would think about, safety. It's not just about how to stop a symptom of safety deprivation like violence, but it's about how to achieve the welfare goods that we all need to be safe, that include things like housing and clean water, because we have to wash our hands in the midst of COVID. Access to education, a real sense of what it means to be a citizen.
Thank you. You all are hearing the process that led to these conversations, that led to these chapters, was really a group process. There was a lot that went into that. So I'd love to hear from you all a little bit about what that experience was like. You each wrote a chapter of the book. It's terrific, each one, and having seen, they look different than they did when they first came forward. And so I'd love to just hear a little bit from you all about what it was like to work with the group, to have your ideas questioned, added to, critiqued by others. Vivian, do you want to, or no, Nancy, go ahead if you're.
Vivian, you should start.
Well, I'm kind of a different writer, so I don't follow like the rules. And, like the formula, whatever just comes out, comes out. And I wrote this rant in May of 2020 after George Floyd. I mean, a rant. And I was like, what am I going to do with this rant? I said, I'll send it to Bruce. And it really was a rant, because, really, that weekend, I was all about quoting NWA. And the rage, the anger, the re-traumatization every time I saw the video just stuck with me, and I thought I would never get out of it. But then when the opportunity came along to write this piece for the book, I went back to that rant. And I asked myself, how are things different for you today? What have you learned? How are you thinking differently? And it's the conversations that we had at that table in that last year that we were meeting as an executive session and the roundtables helped me to understand that what my values were very much about not doing harmful things to other people because they've done harmful things to me or to my people. That if I believed in human dignity, I believed in it for everybody, including police officers. If I believed in truth-telling, I believed in telling everybody's truth, not just my own truth. And if I believed in power sharing, I believed that we should share power equally with everybody. And I had to bring that to a conversation, to an essay about white supremacy. I had to talk about white supremacy without the goal of pointing fingers, blaming, shaming, or retribution, but from the point of view, let's just all get enlightened about this and move and figure out how we can create systems that work for everybody. That was the big change for me, and that only came because of the relationships within Square One.
So as I said, I'm an academic, and what I do is write pretty much all the time. And the thing about being in the executive session is that it's an incredibly generative space. I mean, there are so many ideas flying around all the time that I sort of felt liberated not to have to write about them, but instead to sit and absorb them. And so I think one of the things you could probably see if you looked up things that I've written in the last 3 or 4 years, it's clearly influenced by the executive session and the conversations that we have, even though they're not executive session pieces. And then there's the piece that I wrote for the executive session, which I wrote with a person, one of our colleagues, who describes himself as a libertarian. And if you want to talk about difficult conversations, those of you who were in the room that day, yeah, well, I can say who it is because you'll know. It's Arthur and I had a very difficult conversation at an executive session meeting. And after that conversation, we ended up writing this piece together. And it was really an amazing experience for me to write with him. And, you know, as Vivian was saying, the relationships matter in terms of, you know, expanding how you think about things, but also just opportunities, that having lots and lots of opportunities to see what people are doing in the real world. I've never been an academic who was holed up in the ivory tower. I've done a lot of on-the-ground work, but to have the constant access to people who are doing the work every day was super, super helpful and an amazing learning experience. And, you know, I get to have that actually for as long as we're all on the earth, because I have your email.
I will find you wherever you are. One of the things we talked about in the executive sessions was the importance of changing the narrative. When I was a judge, I used to write a lot of opinions because oftentimes it was saying, I have to do this, and man, is it wrong. It was sort of a constant narrative about what I was doing and what the implications of it was. But I didn't really understand the narrative until this session, these years, because what I was hearing in the room and the conversation in the room was not at all a conversation that, as I said before, judges ever take part in. And so you can live in a box, and you can live in a world where the desire to be neutral means that you have no context, which means that you're contentless, which means that you don't ever have any idea about the communities that you serve. And when I was asked to write for this volume, I wanted to write about reimagining judging. And I was tortured by Anamika for many months. There was no question. When you asked about what the process was, we were all describing it in these wonderful, glorious terms. I felt tortured. There was no question about it. You know, yeah, no, it was, I hadn't been, you know, when you're a judge, nobody assigns deadlines to you, right? You can do whatever, or at least you ignore the deadlines that they assign. And all of a sudden I had someone saying, you know, today. I was going, are we talking, so we had these conversations, are we talking about 5 o'clock? Are we talking about Indonesia Day or a US Day? And I, you know, pushed the envelope, but it forced me to think about to reimagine what I had done and what I think others should do. And ultimately, my essay is about accountability. Judges are accountable to the community they serve. They focus, however, on, you know, rulemaking and rule following, not rulemaking, but rule following. And and not what did I do? What was the impact? What was the context? What was the implication? Even if there's nothing you can do, but it was a broader focus, which this group forced me to have.
Yes, thank you all. That it was a wonderful process, and there were you look at the list of contributors, and there were some others in the executive session as well. And there's not a wallflower, there's not a shy and retiring wallflower among them. So the conversations were robust and really testing each other in a lot of different ways, and reporting back to Anamika when we were done, which was just what we all needed. So I'm going to wrap this up in just a minute and open up for questions from you all for a few minutes. But before doing that, we started this project, as folks had mentioned, 5 years ago. A lot has happened in those 5 years, and so I would pose to you all: are we making progress? Is there what is our opportunity now, and what do you see as coming next?
I've been very troubled the past couple of years, and as my emails to everyone on the executive session reflected, the George Floyd demonstrations were extraordinary and important, and seemed to trigger, we thought, a reckoning, the kind of reckoning that we had begun to talk about in the executive session. And then the reaction. The watching politicians blame a crime spike on, loved it, lenient judges and bail reform, rather than what was in front of them, which was the complete dissolution of all services, of all structures, of all programs. And what that suggested to me was how easy the narrative returned, how easy we sort of slipped back into what I've come to describe to other judges as the habits of mass incarceration. We were stuck in tropes that we could not, it seemed that we were not getting out of, and it suggested how much more work needs to be done.
I'll go next because you should go last. So your first question was, have we made progress? I mean, I think it would be a mistake to say that we've made no progress, because we have, but the kind of progress is the kind of progress that should have happened decades and decades and decades ago. And so to see, police officers who use excessive force are actually finally being charged with crimes, let alone, convicted of them, is a sign of progress, and in a sense, but not enough, not far enough. And also, that kind of accountability is not, I think, what many people are looking for, which is, a transformation of how the state goes about providing these welfare goods for safety. And I think the fact that many more people are aware of the history that so many scholars have been writing about and talking about for decades makes clear that we've had, as we note in the recent National Academy of Sciences report that Bruce and I participated in reducing racial inequalities in the criminal justice system, we had opportunities. We still, as of 2023, have never made good on the Kerner Commission's recommendation to invest in communities that were, disempowered, disadvantaged, and disinvested in decades ago. And so when measured against that yardstick of progress, it's hard to say that we have. I think you had one more question about whether I'm hopeful about anything or something like that. I'll say this: on the days that I'm not, I look on my dresser where I have a picture of my grandmother who isn't with us anymore. She passed when she was 79, and she was my favorite person in the world, and she was a civil rights activist who was born in Selma, Alabama. And, she had unending, undying hope for me, and for my mom, and for our family. And so, on the days that I'm not hopeful, I feel guilty because I feel like I'm not adequately carrying out the legacy that she gave to me.
Have we made progress? It would be wrong to say we haven't, because things have changed somewhat. The conversation comes up much more easily now. When these egregious acts occur, there's immediate response that this is not who we are. What we should be saying is, this is not who we want to be. It is indeed who we are. People are quick to say this is not who we are, which leads me to believe there are enough of us who don't want to be that if we could just harness all of that power, we could figure out how to sway other folks that it doesn't have to be that way, that this adversarial position that we've taken based on old ideas about race and about position and about lies that have been told to everybody, lies that have been told to Black people, indigenous people, other people of color about their inferiority, and lies that have been told to white folks about their superiority. Everybody's been lied to. Everybody. And the reason I'm hopeful is not because there's so much change, although there is some incremental change. Well, that's the only way change can happen. Because just wiping out a segment of our system, the police department, the Department of Corrections, or any other part of our system, wouldn't solve the problem. The problem is much deeper than that. What keeps me hopeful is that there is a never-ending conversation about the issues that is deepening, that is going to the heart of the matter, that is going beyond the superficial, that's going beyond, well, okay, let's fix this law, let's fix that law, let's try to lessen the disparities between how people are treated if they come from certain communities as opposed to other communities. The conversation is going to the fundamental core of our democracy, whether or not we're going to remain a democracy, what systems need to be in place, and where the investments need to be in order for us to retain the vision of democracy that we have. And so now we're seeing things outside of the justice system that have so much to do with justice, like taking, AP African Studies out of schools. And we can relate that to backlash from things that are very related to our justice system. And this is not a new pattern, this is an existing pattern. But there's hope in that pattern. The hope is in the struggle. I say this all the time. I have some news for you, and it may not be good news to some of you. If there is a world without this struggle, if the destination is a world where there is no injustice, where there is never any harm or violence or anything that we have to improve on as the human race, that's not going to happen. Because for me, the human struggle is the constant struggle against injustice. That it's what makes us human. is what makes us human, that we are all different, we are imperfect, there will be challenges in our society. We can improve our society, and every generation will. But a generation without struggle, for me, would be a generation without meaning. The struggle will be different. But my hope is that we are struggling. That gives me hope. That as long as there are human beings on earth, we will struggle. We will fight against injustice, wherever it exists, however it looks, and whoever is the marginalized and sidelined population. There will be people who will stand up and champion their cause. That has been the way it's been throughout history, and that is the way it's going to be in the future. I don't know if that's good or bad news to you, but to me, it's where I find hope. Now, I started the executive session the first day, I believe, by quoting Cornel West, so it's appropriate that I do the same today. And these ideas I'm speaking are very much from I was obsessed with him at one point. And he says that we have to understand the difference between hope and optimism. That optimism is, we look at a situation and we're optimistic. Things are going to change because there's the evidence. You know, we are seeing less disparity in sentencing. We're seeing less disparity in the number of people incarcerated. We're seeing the income gap close, if only that were true. And that's optimism. But hope is not optimism. Because hope says, even if none of those things are true, even if there is no evidence whatsoever, I'm in the struggle for the long haul. I'm in the struggle for justice, for peace, for love, for understanding, for humanity, whether there's evidence or not.
Vivian. Thank you. Thank you all very much. So you all are seeing, first of all, I think everybody's got an idea for a new book chapter after that conversation, right? You can see the power of this conversation, and Square One will be continuing. As Jeremy said, please continue to follow our work and to be involved with our work, because we're committed to the sustained conversation, to the hope, whatever the evidence may say, and to continuing to be in relationship with each other. So we are a little behind schedule. I'd love to take just one, maybe two questions, if anyone has one, and then we'll wrap up. But if anybody has a question, if no one has a question, that's fine too. But
hi there. Thank you so much for the incredibly impactful talk. I wanted to first of all express gratitude, and also ask what people in sciences or fields different than sociology, political science, for example, the hard sciences, how can we contribute to this cause? How can we work with leaders in these fields and also bring that work into our fields and also apply our fields to your work most effectively? Because the goal is to decrease injustice no matter where you are in academia or in your lines of work. So please let me know.
I can think of a couple of things. First of all, you said hard sciences generally, but one of the members of the executive session is Dr. Emily Wong, who's here. And, a lot of the work in the hard sciences, if you want to call it that, supports medicine, right? And so, one thing you can do maybe is to go talk to Emily, and she can tell you some things. But, there are all sorts of ways actually in which research in the hard sciences, especially around some of the issues that we're talking about, are constructed around outdated, old, and racist ideas. So one of the things you can do is work against those concepts And second, I think when we talk about pursuing justice, it has to do with how the people who are doing the research and carry out the research are who those people are, how they're involved in it. And then many of those disciplines, they are heavily male. They're not particularly ethnically and racially diverse. And, as students, you can demand that because part of the questions that, so when you think about evidence, evidence is a set of facts that we use to answer a question. That's all it is. But theory tells you what questions to ask, right? And so the question is, who are going to be the people generating those questions? And I guarantee you, if you get different people in those hallways and in those disciplines, they're going to be asking different questions.
All right, with that, we will wrap up for the evening. A huge last thank you to our panel, to Aisha, to our hosts here, to the MacArthur Foundation, which made this all possible, and the New Press. Thank you all for coming.